I, like John said, live in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. I am not from here. My husband and I moved here in 2020. Um, that's a long story how we got here, but I was good friends with someone who was from Hopkinsville, who I met in grad school, Alyssa Keller, who some of you may be familiar with. She runs the museum here, and in a roundabout way, I ended up here because of Alyssa. And Alyssa is actually the first person who ever even mentioned Edgar Cayce to me. I had never heard about him until grad school when I met Alyssa, and she would tell all of us about Hopkinsville and what an interesting and weird place it is, and how there was a famous clairvoyant who was from Hopkinsville, Edgar Cayce. So that was my first introduction to Edgar Cayce. And years later, we now live here, which I still marvel at every day. And I love Hopkinsville, and I hope that by the end of my presentation today, you've learned something and also love Hopkinsville. So when talking about Edgar Cayce, the location that instantly pops into a lot of people's heads is Virginia Beach. And rightly so. This was the site of the Cayce Hospital. It was the backdrop for much of Cayce's psychic career, and it's still the location of the ARE today. But I think that Edgar's hometown, Hopkinsville, has a really interesting role in his life as well. I think it was very formative in shaping him in the early years when he was first starting to explore his gift. And I think that it also shaped his attitude towards his gift, particularly in the beginning. So I think that we are missing out on a lot if we don't look into the Hopkinsville side of the story. So my talk today is structured like a virtual walking tour. We're going to visit 8 different sites, all on one street, 7th Street. These are all places where people lived who had readings done by Edgar, or Edgar potentially lived in some of these homes or worked in some of the businesses. This isn't comprehensive. I'm sure there are tons more buildings that I'm not going to mention today that have some kind of tie to Edgar Cayce on 7th Street. So if any of you have any other places you know of, please let me know. I will do a question answer session at the end of this. So if you've got questions or comments, just put them in the chat box or hold them to the end, and I'll try my best to answer. Just one little note, we will be jumping around chronologically quite a bit between about 1893 and 1913. So try your best to keep up. It's even confusing to me sometimes. So before we get started with the Edgar Cayce side of this, I want to just introduce you to Hopkinsville. Hopkinsville is located in Western Kentucky. You can see on this map, the green star is Hopkinsville. It's in Christian County, which is on the border with Tennessee. It shares Fort Campbell, a very large military base, with 3 other counties in Kentucky and in Tennessee. It's often called the Pearl of the Pennyrile historically. Today, most people just call it Hoptown. And this little graphic on the right is a map from, I believe, 1878 that shows Hopkinsville as this little amoeba in pink. And we'll come back to this map in a minute. So Hopkinsville is in Christian County. Like I said, it's a really rural setting. The town itself is 32,000 people today. So for me, I think that puts it pretty firmly in the category of small city rather than small town. It's bigger than a lot of places I've lived. But the area surrounding the town is very, very agricultural. What it's known best for is actually dark-fired tobacco. That's not the primary crop, but it's something that's only grown in this region and in Tennessee, the region of Tennessee just below Kentucky, or just below this area of Kentucky. And this little image on the top right with the barn smoking, if you come to Hopkinsville or Christian County in the summer or the fall, this is a site that you'll see and smell, because they actually cure the tobacco by putting it in a barn, closing all the doors, and then lighting fires underneath to cure the tobacco. So it's a really unique thing that happens really only here. Hopkinsville was founded in 1804. By 1870, it had about 3,000 people who lived here. 1877, Edgar Cayce was born in Beverly, not actually Hopkinsville. Beverly was a tiny little farming community that was about 7 miles south of Hopkinsville. It's still a place today, but barely. Most of the people who lived in Beverly in 1877 were Cayces. So it was all just the huge extended Cayce family. In 1880, Gertrude Evans, Edgar's future wife, was born in Hopkinsville. By 1890, the town had nearly doubled in size. Almost 6,000 people lived here. And in 1893, Edgar Cayce's family moved to Hopkinsville. So at that point in time, he was 16 or 17 years old. His father, Leslie B. Cayce, and his mother, Carrie, made the move with his 4 younger sisters. And then later, Edgar decided to join them. By 1910, the city had pretty much doubled in size again and had nearly 9,500 people living here. And it kind of tops out at that number for the rest of Edgar Cayce's time here. This is a photograph of the main intersection in town taken by Edgar Cayce, photographer, around probably 1910. So this is East 9th Street running right here, and then Main Street running right here. And this building on the corner on the right is called the Phoenix, and actually just got demolished about 3 weeks ago. But that being said, a lot of the built environment here still dates to Edgar Cayce's time. So if you come here and visit, and I think you all should, a lot of the buildings that you're looking at are the same buildings that Edgar would have seen on his walk into work or over to the hill to see Gertrude. Okay, so getting into the main part of our talk today, this is a little map with the 8 locations that we will be talking about, and we're going to start at the top right and work our way left. So these 2 stars at the top right are our first 2 sites, and they're actually located just outside of town. They're on 7th Street after it has begun to be called Russellville Road. So our first stop is Western State Hospital. This is Western State Hospital today. It still operates. It's enormous. It's a mental facility, and it employs a number of the people who live in Hopkinsville. The reason it comes into our story is because of this man in the middle, Samuel Salter. Samuel Salter was Gertrude Evans' grandfather. Gertrude eventually married Edgar Cayce, but Samuel Salter came to Hopkinsville to work on the Western Kentucky Lunatic Asylum, as it was initially called. So Western State was built in 1848, and Samuel Salter worked as the lead carpenter on the project. He was originally from Pennsylvania, but came here via Cincinnati, where he had gone to school to be an architect. And he was a really skilled carpenter. I believe he was a joiner, which is the kind of carpenter who builds staircases, which is mathematically a very challenging profession. So he was a really smart man. And I think that the family that he established here really reflects a lot of his own personal values and qualities. So in 1857, shortly after he arrived here, he met Susan Jones, a local girl who he married, and they set up a family. When he died, Salter's obituary, a little blip of which is right here, said that he always aimed at the highest and achieved the best. And like I said, I think that this special quality that everybody in the Salter family seemed to have was due to his own shaping. In terms of a group of people that would foster and encourage Edgar's talent, I don't think that there was a better family for him to marry into. The other reason I have Western State as our first stop is because it's really an interesting backdrop to the Cayce story. Mental illness was really not understood well in the 1800s or much of the 1900s for that case. There was an idea, a really common idea in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that if a person spent too much time in hypnosis, they could become insane. So this context as the backdrop for Cayce first discovering his special gift and then starting to work through his emotions surrounding it, I think is a really important thing to keep in mind. All right, on to the Hill. The Salter family home in Hopkinsville was known as the Hill. It's actually just outside town, right by Western State Hospital. The house itself was built before the Civil War. It was situated on about 10 acres. They had fruit groves. It was supposed to have been a beautiful location. And there is a river. The earliest biography about Edgar Cayce, Thomas Segru, relates the story that Samuel Salter told his children that the Hill was always supposed to remain debt-free, so that any family member who needed it as a haven could come back at any time and live there. And this mentality, I think, was almost prophetic, because a number of Salter's children and grandchildren ended up moving back to the Hill. This included two of his daughters, Elizabeth and Kate, and their families. Both women had husbands who died really young, and both of them returned to the Hill and raised their families there. So Gertrude, Edgar's future wife, was Elizabeth's daughter, and the Hill was the backdrop to hers and Edgar's courtship and even marriage. They actually married at the Hill in 1903. The Hill also was the setting for some of the most important and well-known readings and events in Edgar Cayce's career, including the Tommy House Jr. reading. So this lovely lady on the right is Carrie Salter. She was the youngest daughter of Samuel Salter, which made her Gertrude Evans' aunt, but she was only a couple years older than Gertrude. And so the two of them grew up more like cousins than like aunt and niece. Carrie was a really staunch supporter of Edgar Cayce. She was vivacious and outgoing, and in some of Cayce's earliest photography ventures, she actually backed him financially and loaned him money. So she was someone who was kind of always there for Edgar Cayce when he needed her, and she always encouraged him to use his psychic abilities because she thought that they were a gift from God. Carrie married Dr. Thomas House of Springfield, Tennessee in 1907 or early 1908. And in the spring of 1908, she fell really, really ill. All of the doctors who examined her, including her husband, thought that she had a tumor in her abdomen. But Carrie was unsatisfied with this diagnosis, and she asked Edgar to come back from Bowling Green, where he was living at the time, and give a reading for her. So of course he did. He came to the Hill, he laid down on the couch, and he gave a reading in which he revealed that Carrie was pregnant. This was a bombshell because Carrie was not supposed to be able to have children. 7 months later, baby Tommy House was born. He was tiny, sickly, and suffered from convulsions from the day of his birth. The story goes that nobody at the Hill thought that baby Tommy was going to make it through the winter except for Carrie, who never doubted once that her baby was going to live. Unfortunately, Tommy grew increasingly sicker. He wouldn't eat, and by February of 1909, he was having a convulsion every 20 minutes. Once again, Carrie called Edgar to come home from Bowling Green and give a reading. Her unexpected pregnancy had been a bombshell, but this reading outstripped it by far. Edgar awoke to pandemonium. He had prescribed a lethal dose of belladonna, which is a poison, to be administered to the baby. Another local doctor was there, Dr. Jackson, who had actually treated the Cayce family for years, and he was pleading with Carrie to not follow Edgar's instructions. Carrie, however, never doubted Edgar once, and she insisted that they do exactly what Edgar had prescribed. After all, she said he was the only one who had correctly diagnosed her problem nearly a year before. So the belladonna was administered, and baby Tommy immediately stopped convulsing and went to sleep. He grew into a healthy baby boy, and he lived into his 60s, dying in 1972. Another important event that played out at the Hill was Dr. Hugo Munsterberg's visit in 1912. Munsterberg was a German doctor and professor who was visiting Harvard at the time. And in 1910 and 1911, a really important series of articles made it into the national media about Edgar Cayce and his abilities. So Munsterberg did not believe them for 1 minute and decided that he was going to catch Cayce flat-footed and expose him. So in January of 1912, he rolled up on a train in Hopkinsville, got off at the depot, which is this little green building still here today, and took a cab out to the Hill. At this point in time, Edgar and Gertrude weren't actually living at the house at the Hill. They were living in a little cottage off to the side. And Munsterberg barged in on them and demanded that Edgar tell him all of his tricks. Unfazed, Edgar offered to let him see a reading the next day. So Munsterberg came around, attended the reading, and left with a changed mind. He still didn't understand Edgar's gift, but he believed that it was genuine and that Edgar Cayce was not a fraud. He also supposedly cautioned Edgar to be careful about the men who he was working with, and we will come back to this extensively later. The Hill unfortunately burned in 1964, so it is no longer there. Okay, our third stop is well within the city limits. It is the Lucian Davis house at 717 East 7th Street. It's a lot of sevens. Lucian Davis was a prominent businessman in Hopkinsville. I did not know about this story until probably about 2 months ago, and I didn't expect it to be very well known or very well documented. And I don't think that it's very well known now, but at the time that it happened, just because of the timing with all of the national newspaper articles that came out about Edgar Cayce, the story was actually extremely well known. So we're going to look a little bit into Lucian Davis's past before we get to his story. He's a little bit of a rags to riches story. He was born in 1870 in Hopkinsville. His parents were Lee and Elizabeth Davis. His dad was a farm laborer who later became a grocer. So he was born into a very normal family, not wealthy at all. And he just went through the normal public schools for boys here in Hopkinsville. When he finished the schooling available to him here, he went to Evansville, Indiana, and got a certificate in business from Evansville Commercial College. This is kind of it would be like an associate's degree today. So he came back to Hopkinsville after that, and he got a job at a dry goods store as a clerk. And he continued to work in the dry goods store, but he started running for public office at the same time. In 1895, when he was about 25 years old, he was elected city clerk, and he just kept doing this and getting elected to more and more important positions as time went on. Eventually, he was the treasurer for Western State Hospital. He was elected master commissioner for the city in 1912, and he owned the Princess Theater, which is still here in its second version in the middle today. The original one was the first movie theater in Hopkinsville, and it unfortunately burned in the 1920s, but was rebuilt. He also started his own contracting business. It was a building business. He was a stone contractor, as you may have guessed from his house. And I think that was really aided by his marriage to Nora Dalton, who was a member of the Dalton family here, who we'll talk about pretty substantially today. They owned the Dalton Brick Company and were the premier building company in Hopkinsville. So in 1907, Lucian Davis built this house, which is right next door to where I'm giving you this presentation from today. Its inside is grand. It's obviously a reflection of his wealth and standing in Hopkinsville, and it was obviously built with the goal of bringing a lot of other important people into the house and entertaining them. It was here that Davis fell ill in January of 1910. A doctor in Hopkinsville diagnosed the problem as his appendix and said that if Lucian Davis didn't get the appendix taken out, he only had 6 weeks to live. Davis wasn't exactly anxious to go under the knife, and so he went and got a couple other opinions, and all of the doctors agreed that he needed to get his appendix removed. By this point in time, however, he had worked himself into such a state that nobody would do surgery on him with his anxiety. And so they sent him home to Hopkinsville, and he went and started to see Dr. Wesley Ketchum, a homeopath, who was supposed to be basically treating his anxiety and getting him into a state of mind where he could actually go and have the surgery that he needed. Dr. Ketchum treated Lucian Davis for about a month with very little effect, and basically in exasperation, Ketchum was like, I know this guy, he's a psychic, maybe he can help you. What do you think? And Davis's response, according to Ketchum, was, well, he can do no worse than your doctors, so bring him on. At this point in time, Cayce was actually working in Anniston, Alabama as a photographer, but he accepted a train ticket from Ketchum to come back to Hopkinsville that summer in 1910 and do a reading for Davis. He diagnosed the problem not as appendicitis, but as spinal lesions and an overtaxed nervous system. After 3 months of following Cayce's orders in a sanatorium, Lucian Davis made a complete recovery. And the timing of this was impeccable because he finished his treatments about at the end of August in 1910. And in October of 1910, the first national story about Edgar Cayce and his psychic abilities came out in the New York Times. So when the story came out and newspaper reporters flocked to Hopkinsville and started to try to find out whatever they could about Edgar Cayce, Lucian Davis went public with his own story to try to validate what Cayce was doing and lend him some support. Actually, as a follow-up to the Chicago Examiner's 2-page spread on Cayce in 1911, they actually did a whole special just on the Lucian Davis case that ran in the paper in, I think, February of 1911. So our next stop is the George Dalton house, less than a block away. And George Dalton just happens to be Davis's brother-in-law. Remember how I mentioned Nora Dalton? That's George Davis's sister. And George Dalton, I looked at Lucian Davis's will the other day, and George Dalton, I think, was probably his closest friend. He made him the guardian for his children and left him quite a bit. So George was the senior partner of Dalton Brothers Brick Company. The Dalton family was originally from Tennessee, but moved to Hopkinsville in the late 1880s. There had been a bunch of fires downtown that had kind of wiped out most of downtown. And so they came, bought the local brickyard, and then rebuilt a lot of downtown. And if you walk through downtown Hopkinsville today, a lot of the buildings that you see are thanks to the Dalton Brick Company. So George and his wife, Ada, built this house at the corner of 7th Street and Campbell Street. It's a massive Queen Anne brick residence. It's really cool. It's not there today. This is what's there today, a gas station. It was demolished in the 1960s to build this gas station. So one of the things for me, like the George Dalton story, is kind of the opposite of my experience with the Lucian Davis story. I went into the Lucian Davis case thinking that it wasn't very well known, it wasn't very well documented, and neither of those things were true. The George Dalton story, I'm going to bet that most of you know off the top of your heads. It's certainly one of the first stories that I ever learned about Cayce, and it's often stated as the first time that a pin was used to pin like a broken bone back together, and Cayce prescribed that. So that's a story I've always heard of the George Dalton story. But I started to actually look into what I could find out in newspapers and other documents about it, including the Cayce material. And what I found was that the story itself was not ever mentioned by Edgar Cayce It's not mentioned in Thomas Segru's There's a River. The first time it's mentioned is by Dr. Wesley Ketchum, who we've talked about a little bit and are going to talk about a lot more. And it's in 1962, almost 20 years after Edgar Cayce's death in California. Ketchum was invited to give a talk to a Cayce group, and he came out with this bombshell of a story. So I started to look into what I could find out about it, and I found this. So Ketchum, when he talked about the story, was well into his 80s. And so I think a lot of the discrepancies are perhaps from his just being like 55 years out from it actually happening. And I think some of it is probably exaggeration or maybe outright lying as well, which we'll get into in a second. But he placed the accident in 1906 or 1907. It actually happened on May 31st, 1905, and the newspaper reported on it. So the way the story goes is that George Dalton was on a site visit to this building, the new freight depot, which is at 9th Street. That's the street you're looking at, and the railroad tracks. It's still here today. I walk past it like literally every day. The building was still being built, and so there were not any steps in front of the front door. And when George Dalton was leaving, he stepped down about 18 inches, landed wrong on his leg, and broke his leg in 2 places. He had to be carried to his house, which is really only a block from there. And according to Ketchum, a number of doctors showed up to try to treat him. According to Ketchum's story, there were 5 doctors, and they all decided that George Dalton should just pick whichever one of them he wanted to treat them. So he says that George Dalton chose him, which is really interesting because he had just arrived in town near the end of 1904. So he was a newcomer. He was also a homeopath, which is or was kind of a fad in medicine, a kind of folky fad in medicine in the early 1900s. And the normal physicians kind of looked down on homeopaths. And also, according to Ketchum, he called himself a Yankee. And so he said that the other doctors didn't like him because of that. So anyways, all of the other doctors left except for one, Dr. Anderson, who did tell him if he needed help to let him know. According to Ketchum, he put Dalton's leg in traction, and then he went and consulted Cayce, who told him to have a very specific kind of nail made and actually hammer it into his kneecap. I'm not a medical historian, but I did do a quick Google search on pinning bones, and it wasn't really common practice until the 1970s. This was 1905. So this would have been a really revolutionary treatment for the time, and probably raised a lot of eyebrows. So anyways, he was aided in doing this, according to him, by Dr. Anderson. And then he said after several weeks, they wanted to check on how the leg was healing. And so they carried him out of the house on a bed down to his office on the corner of 7th Street and Virginia, which will be our next stop, and took an x-ray. He said also that he had the only x-ray machine in town. So according to him, George Dalton made a full recovery, and 30 years later when he died, still had the nail in his knee. This is all really sensational, and so I thought surely the newspapers picked it up. And sure enough, the story about him being carried down the street made the newspaper and is true. But there's a couple differences in here from what Dr. Ketchum said. For one, it happened just a week after the accident. The date on it is like June 6th of 1905. And they actually went to Dr. Blakey's office. He was another doctor in town because I think Blakey actually had the only x-ray machine in town. So there's a little bit of, exaggeration on Ketchum's part here, which I think is fairly routine. So I started to wonder a lot about this case, and I just started to look up everything I could having to do with all of the people involved. And Edgar Cayce actually placed his own first meeting with Ketchum not until 1909, 4 years after this incident, when he was home in Hopkinsville for Christmas and his dad introduced them. Dr. Ketchum claimed that his first meeting with Edgar Cayce was actually years earlier, when he had accompanied Dr. House to Bowling Green to get help from Edgar on a particularly difficult case, which could very well have been this one. But if it's true, Edgar didn't even remember it, which seems kind of odd for a case that we think is like so important and interesting. Later, when he was talking about a different case from 1910, Dr. Ketchum also revealed that when he had prominent patients, he would often obtain readings for them, treat them just like Cayce told him to, but then not tell them anything about Cayce's involvement, because in his own words, it was weird. So the more I've picked at the story, the more I've realized that Dr. Ketchum is a problematic witness. And Thomas Segru pretty blatantly stated this in There Is a River when he was talking about the 1910 New York Times article that was a direct result of Ketchum's trip to California, in which he gave this talk unbeknownst to Cayce about Cayce's work. What Thomas Segru said about it was, some of these reported were Lane's cases, an earlier homeopath who Cayce had worked with. There was a description of the Dietrich case, for instance. For Ketchum, he had only given 2 sets of readings. Apparently, Ketchum, on a visit to California, had told some tall tales, and when asked to elaborate them in a scientific paper, had rounded up all the available evidence in Hopkinsville. So this leaves us with the question of, can you trust what Dr. Ketchum said, and how much of the George Dalton case, as we know it, is actually true? By 1962, when Ketchum came out with all this information, literally everybody who had been involved in this case was dead except for him. So he could say whatever he wanted pretty much with impunity. So was this a different doctor's case that Ketchum learned about and then appropriated? I don't really have a good answer for this, but I'm going to keep looking into it because I think it's really interesting. Our next stop is the Dalton Brothers building. The Dalton Brothers building was Dr. Ketchum's office. It's the site that he's very clearly talking about George Dalton being carried to in 1905, but it wasn't actually finished until August of 1905. So he wasn't in it at the time of the Dalton case. The first floor was the brick company's office, and then they rented out offices on the second floor, and Ketchum took one of those offices. So Edgar's first reading here was done in 1909, when he said that he first met Dr. Ketchum. Edgar's father, Leslie, introduced him to Ketchum, who was supposedly dying to meet him. Ketchum really wanted to see a reading, but Edgar told him he only did it if there was a person who was really in need. And so Ketchum said, hold on, ran out to the hotel across the street, came back with a little written piece of paper and said, okay, I've got someone who needs help here. And Edgar did a reading for it, and it turns out that Ketchum tricked him, and the reading was actually for himself because he thought he had appendicitis and was trying to catch Edgar Cayce as a fraud. So that gives you a little introduction to Dr. Ketchum. Dr. Ketchum figures in really prominently to Edgar Cayce's story here in Hopkinsville, particularly between 1910 and 1912. So I think it would behoove us to look a little bit into who he actually was. Ketchum was born in 1879 in Ohio. He was a homeopath, which I've already talked about a little bit. He was probably a really good doctor, but was somewhat looked down on by the other doctors because he was a homeopath. He married a woman named Velma about 1903 and came here to Hopkinsville in 1904, where he established himself as a doctor. Ketchum claims that his first meeting with Edgar Cayce was sometime in like 1905 to 1907 in the story I just recounted, where he went to Bowling Green. Edgar placed their first meeting at the end of 1909. So whatever the case is and the truth is about those two discrepancies, Edgar did give 2 sets of readings for Dr. Ketchum over the summer of 1910 when he was living in Anniston, Alabama, and working as a photographer. So Edgar was not wild about Dr. Ketchum. Personally, they just didn't have very much in common, and I don't think they got along very well, but Dr. Ketchum really liked to use Edgar for readings to help him out with his patients. And so he would send Edgar a train ticket back to Hopkinsville, and Edgar would come back, give a couple readings, and see his family. And that's where the Lucian Davis reading that we talked about already figured in. So Edgar Cayce did not keep up with Ketchum, and so he had no idea in September of 1910 when Ketchum went to California and gave a talk for a bunch of other homeopathic physicians that he was talking about Edgar Cayce. So he went and gave this talk to about 300 physicians, and they were wild about it and asked him to write a scientific paper on it. So Ketchum wrote a paper which ended up being published in Chicago and presented in Boston later in 1910. And this is what prompted the first national scale article about Edgar Cayce to be published in the New York Times, which this is a copy of it, but it got picked up and rerun in papers all across America. So I actually think it's really beautiful, but illiterate man becomes doctor when hypnotized is, not quite accurate. Cayce was not at all illiterate. So anyways, Cayce was down in Alabama working as a photographer when this came out, and learned about it because a newspaper reporter came to his studio and was like, "Is this man you?" And Cayce was like, yeah, but I don't know anything about this. So he immediately bought a train ticket, came home to Hopkinsville, confronted Dr. Ketchum about this, and shortly after that decided to return to Hopkinsville full-time and start a psychic business with his father, Leslie Cayce, who's up in the top left corner, Dr. Ketchum himself, and a man named Albert No, who ran the Hotel Latham, which was the nicest hotel in town at the time. So this moves us down to our next stop, which is a little bit of a cheat. We're going to stand in the intersection here of Main Street and 7th and kind of peer down at a couple of different spots that are Main Street, but are important to the story. So we can see 4 locations important to Cayce's story from this one intersection. You have Holland's Opera House all the way down on the left. You then have the Fleming Building, these columns directly on the left, which this whole block used to be known as the Thompson Block, and it was a number of buildings. They all burned in, I think, 1984, but the Thompson Block housed the Hopper Brothers bookstore and Cayce's photography studio. And then down on the right, you have the Christian County Courthouse, which is still there and dates to 1869. So these are just some close-ups of those buildings. Unfortunately, Holland's Opera House, not looking too hot in this picture, has since been demolished like within the past year. So we have lost that site. But this little map down below shows you Holland's Opera House. And we're going to come back to the significance of Holland's in a little bit. But it has to do with this man, Hart the Laugh King, who was a traveling hypnotist who came here 3 times in 1899 and 1900. So the Fleming Building is a new building. Like I said, the Thompson Block has been demolished, but the very first place that Edgar worked in Hopkinsville was Hopper Bookstore, which I've highlighted in yellow on this little map. And then later, once he had a photography studio here in 1910, he noted that it was in the building right next door to where he had worked at the bookstore. So shortly after the New York Times article about Edgar came out in 1910, he went into business with his father, Wesley Ketchum, and Albert No, doing psychic diagnostician stuff. But he felt very weird about this, and he felt very strongly that he shouldn't be accepting money for this because it was a gift, and he still wasn't very sure where it came from or if it was even okay to do. And so part of the partnership agreement was that the other 3 partners would pay for him to have his own photography studio. And so they set him up in this corner of the Thompson Building on the 2nd floor with a photography studio. And 2 times a day, he would give readings, and the rest of the day, he would work as a photographer. So fast forward for about 2 years, and we're down at the courthouse. In about 1912, Edgar began to suspect that Ketchum was doing some funny business when he was under. So he was waking up and feeling really like nauseous and just physically bad after his readings, which was not the typical situation. And so he confronted Dr. Ketchum about this, and Dr. Ketchum admitted that he was asking him to give him the results of horse races and things like this for him to bet on for them to make more money. And this, of course, infuriated Edgar. They had a big blow up, and then shortly after that, he also had a blow up with Abernethy and decided that he didn't want to do this anymore, and they had violated their end of the contract. So his dad was trying to act as arbiter, and he brought suit against Edgar and Abernethy to try to get them to uphold their ends of the contract and to keep the business going. So in March of 1913, this was in the court, and this man down here on the bottom left, Judge J.T. Hanbury, threw the case out. 2 years earlier, he had actually consulted with Edgar and told him that the contract was legal. But the reason he threw the case out of court was on the grounds of the contract being illegal. So the partnership between the four men broke up after this happened. Ketchum closed down his entire practice in Hopkinsville and actually skipped town with the French teacher from Bethel College, Catherine de Tunk. His wife, Velma, later obtained a divorce and took their son, Alton, back to Ohio to live with her mother. And after this incident, Edgar also moved his family out of Hopkinsville. They went down to Selma, where he ran a photography studio for a number of years. All right, our second to last stop is 530 West 7th Street. This was the house that Edgar's parents lived in 1900. His parents are pictured right here, Carrie Major and Leslie B. Cayce. And it's kind of hard to track their moves because Leslie was constantly in financial trouble, and so they ended up moving houses quite a bit. But this is the house that we believe Edgar did his first reading in on his own voice in 1901. So in January of 1900, Edgar, we're kind of going back in time a little bit here. This is before Edgar and Gertrude married. He's kind of between jobs, is not doing the psychic thing yet. So he decided to go into business selling insurance with his father, Leslie. And one day in the winter of 1900, he was in a town near here and he passed out. And when he woke up, he was back here at the house, his parents' house, and he couldn't speak above a whisper. Nobody thought that very much of this issue at the time, but as the weeks went on, his voice wouldn't heal. He was constantly hoarse and he couldn't speak in a normal voice at all. So a number of doctors came and looked at him. People couldn't figure out what was wrong. And the short story of this is that for a year, this condition persisted. A traveling hypnotist, Hart the Laugh King, who we already met at Holland's Opera House, claimed that for $200, he could get Edgar to regain his voice. So it must have been when Hart passed through in February of 1900 that he got together with Edgar. He would put Edgar into a state of hypnosis, and while hypnotized, Edgar could speak in a normal voice. It seemed like he was healed. But then when he woke up, his voice reverted back to a whisper and he couldn't speak normally anymore, even after Hart would give him a suggestion to, maintain the healing when he awoke. So eventually Hart had to give up. A number of different doctors, hypnotists, and professors came through and tried to heal Edgar, and none of them could. Eventually, Al Lane, a local man who had done a certificate course in medicine, took up the case. And this time he just acted as a guide while Edgar fell asleep and diagnosed his own problem. So Edgar gave himself the suggestion to increase circulation to his throat. And when he awoke, this time he could speak in a normal voice. It seemed like he had been healed, and his voice stayed normal for a couple of weeks, but then he started to lose it again. And so every so often Lane would come back, he would put Edgar under, and Edgar would give himself the same suggestion, but he was kind of tied to Lane because of this situation. And it took a long time for his voice to heal permanently. Our final stop is 705 West 7th Street. We're ending this virtual tour really where Edgar's story in Hopkinsville began. This was the first house that the Cayces lived in when they moved from Beverly to Hopkinsville. This was the house where Edgar lived when he met the famous evangelist Dwight L. Moody. He lived here when he worked at the Hopper Brothers bookstore, and probably most importantly, he lived here when he first met Gertrude Evans, who later became his wife and partner. The house is gone. It was demolished to build the sheriff's station. And in 1903, the Cayces moved away from Hopkinsville for good. They went to Dayton, Ohio for 2 years, and then on to Virginia Beach, where they lived out the rest of their lives. Upon their deaths, however, both Edgar and Gertrude came home to Hopkinsville and were laid to rest at Riverside Cemetery with their parents, siblings, and infant son, Milton Porter. So their story begins and ends, and I would say continues here in Hopkinsville. All right, I will take questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much, Grace. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
At the museum, we'll have a Cayce Day in the spring next year. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this year it's going to be March 23rd, which I think is probably a Friday. I haven't looked it up. It may be a Saturday. It's always around Casey's birthday, and we do like a birthday celebration. It's a Saturday. So it will start around 10 o'clock in the morning and run into the afternoon. And every year we do different things, but we always have presentations, and sometimes we have like videos about Cayce that play all day. And then we have a lot of foods that Cayce told people they should eat. So we have like a buffet of mummy food and things like that. And then we switch out, but there's sometimes crafts and other activities. So it's always really fun. It's like a relaxing day, and a lot of people come from out of town as well. All right, so relatives, yes, there are a lot of Cayces who still are here. A lot of Cayces.
David has a question. Please, David.
Yes, thank you. Grace, you gave a presentation last year on Cayce history, and my question for you today is, are you in any way working with the Cayce archives and library to preserve the work that you're doing? Because your work is really valuable and quite unique. And my experience in doing a little of my own research is that they seem to be interested in what people were doing to share their discoveries about Cayce. So I was wondering if you were doing that, or if you would be doing that.
Okay, to answer your question, I haven't been doing that, but that's a very good suggestion, and I probably should look into that. Yeah, I will.
Thank you.
There are a couple more questions here. So is William Turner still an active advocate for Cayce? Yes and no. Anyone who knows William may not know that he actually suffered a stroke a couple years ago, and so he's doing okay, but his activities are much reduced because of it. So he's also quite old at this time. But yeah, he still talks about Cayce and does what he can. Oh, Clarksville, nice. What do I enjoy and love the most about the Cayce history? I really like the side of it that you've seen today, which is kind of just like seeing where the historical documents line up with what people have said, and what Cayce himself said about his own life and the readings. So that's probably my favorite part. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'd like to just encourage you a little bit more with this kind of work you're doing. you might consider maybe you're on a path to doing your own book about the Cayce history.
Oh, well, thank you.
And
All
I'm
right.
just,
Thank you everyone for listening to my talk and having me here today. Oh, Moody. So if you don't know about Dwight L. Moody and Cayce's connection, you should refer to There's a River or Cayce's memoirs. He met Dwight L. Moody, I think in 1895. Moody came through and did a series of revivals, I guess you would call them, here in Hopkinsville, and Cayce ran into him supposedly because their cow had gotten out and he was looking for it, and he ran into Moody while looking for the cow down by the river, and told Moody about his gift and everything, and Moody encouraged him. But if you read Thomas Segru's account of it, it's, you know, a lot better than what I just told you.
any more questions or comments for Grace? All right, well, we'll mark your calendars. Oh, we'll mark your calendars for March 23rd in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. If you're going to make it out there, I think everyone should. March 23rd is probably the best day.
Oh, Alyssa.
Alyssa's here?
I guess so, yeah. Unless someone is impersonating her.
Oh, I'm here. I'm here.
Do you want to say hi, Alyssa?
I'll say hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Alyssa. I'm the one who lured Grace here, thankfully, and am the director of the museum. We are still working on our plans for Cayce Day, but we're penciling it in for March 23rd, and we would love to have y'all with us.
Fantastic. We can't see you, we just hear you. So thank you, Alyssa. Thank you. Alyssa is fantastic. If you go to Hopkinsville, make sure you go to the Penny Royal Museum.